Ganga, you can start now.
Okay. Okay, sir.
Yes, we are live now. Yeah, go ahead.
Namaste. Good evening, Sabai Janalai. Thank you so much for joining in, Sabai Jana. And I would like to thank my guest speakers and our moderator, Manish Samnani, sir, for his immense effort. For making this live conversation happen exclusively for the population of Nepal. And I'm so grateful that we have been given this opportunity. This will mark a huge impact on how we see autism and our perspective on the future autism has. So I hope you all will take along a lot of things from this live conversation. And firstly, I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Mr. Manish Samnani. He is a PhD scholar. He has a Master of Occupational Therapy in Pediatrics. He graduated his BOT in 2000, and he did his post-graduation and completed in pediatric OT in 2005 with a gold medal. He is the clinical director of SOCH Gurgaon and manages a multidisciplinary team of 35 therapists since 10 years. He is on advisory board to InSync Hyderabad, ACE School Gurgaon, Duish Kolkata, Autism Center Ludhiana, Zeher Chittagong, and Faith Bangladesh. He has certification in sensory integration and certification in neurodevelopmental therapy and trained in developmental assessment scales for Indian infants. He has served in Jamia Hamdard for graduate and postgraduate occupational therapy students. He has presented papers in conferences of EOTA and European SI Congress, that is Sensory Integration Congress. He has developed and presented parents and professionals workshops about OT in autism, behavior, and sensory integration in multiple cities across India and abroad. He organizes and contributes to professional development programs and short-term courses in collaboration with Adelphi University, New York, Council for SI Education, Missouri State University, Thomas Jefferson University for OT, and other professionals in India and neighboring countries. He was the Autism Indian OT expert on the US based Autism Live program. He has published 3 research papers in Indian Journal of Occupational Therapy and also in Sensory Integration International. Currently, he has been appointed as the Asia Regional Lead for International Normative Data Collection Project by Thomas Jefferson University and IRS Sensory Integration. He is the president of Haryana chapter of All India Occupational Therapist Association and is working in collaboration with OT and other allied health professionals as guide, mentor, and supervisor, supported by his wife, Mrs. Malika Samnani, who is also an OT and PhD scholar. Thank you so much for, sir, for your immense effort for making this happen. And I like you to pass the introduction for our guest speakers. And there you go. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ganga. I think it was quite a long introduction for the moderator of the program. However, without further delay, let me welcome Dr. Grandin and Dr. Stephen Shore. We all know who they are. They are people who do not need any sort of introduction. They are
Right.
the pioneers. They are the people who have their first person accounts of experiencing and navigating autism, and they are not just people who have overcome the life and the challenges associated, but they have also have developed autism as their own strength. I welcome Dr. Grandin and Dr. Stephen Shore. Both of you are highly looked upon speakers, faculty, a source of knowledge here in Indian region, in India, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, and around the globe. I'm very sure. Stephen has visited India couple of times now, I think a dozen times already, and he has also done some specific programs with us where we have been able to meet face to face, and we have done something on expressive arts side and other related fields of knowledge to autism. Dr. Grandin, of course, we welcome you again with me at the previous program that we had with you. Let me tell you that that program was very, very successful in terms of creating a sense of hope, a sense of optimism, a sense of strength in all entire community relating to autism. I had received a lot of appreciation to you, to the feedback or inputs received, to the whole program and the concept as well. And I'm so grateful to you to be able to accept whenever we invite you, whenever we kind of hope that you should be with us. You gracefully accept, take out your precious time, and Stephen, Dr. Stephen as well. So we are here one more time, and we are here because we wanted to touch base with a lot of people in Nepal as well, because it's a country which has so much of a cultural similarity with India, but yet it might still be something that is still to be reached out to. So with Ganga's help, we are trying to communicate with parents there, but of course there are all kinds of parents who are welcome, who can join us and put in their questions. So we welcome both of you, and if you both of you have any opening note or any opening message for us in India, in Nepal, and for any other viewers who are viewing this program. Dr. Grandin. It might still be something that is still to be reached out to. So with Dr. Grandin, if you would like.
Yes. Okay, do you want me to start?
Yes,
Yes.
you start. I started last
Okay.
time, you start this time.
All right, then I'm going to just start out, introduce myself. I'm Temple Grandin. I am now a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. I've been a research scientist and a professor now for 30 years. And I've designed all kinds of equipment for our livestock industry. And when I was 4 years old, I had no speech. You see, the thing about autism is when the children are very little, 2 years old, 3 years old, may not have speech, may have a lot of repetitive behavior, do not interact with people. That's the way I looked. A child can look really severe when they're extremely young. But if you do a lot of teaching with that child, I was one of the ones that got me talking. See, autism is what's called a continuous trait. What does that mean? You can have somebody who's a little bit socially awkward that had no speech delay, but have a few of the traits. I had speech delay. And then there's some, when they're young, they've got more problems like epilepsy, but it's a true continuous trait. And you cannot tell when the child is 2 or 3 what the outcome's going to be. But the research shows very clearly that you've got to work with this little kid who's not talking. I don't care what the diagnosis is. Little kids that are not talking, people need to work with them. Start playing turn-taking games. A lot of that was done with me. If the child is spinning a coin, then let's take turns spinning a coin, or take turns playing with a toy car. They're a little bit older. I was taught how to wait and take turns with board games, just simple board games. You've got to engage them. Other things I was taught was how to eat correctly with utensils, taught to dress myself. The worst thing you can do with little children that are not talking is to just do nothing. Let them just sit in the corner. The research is very, very clear. The younger that you start working with a nonverbal child that's not talking, the better results you have. And before we went live, Dr. Shore was talking about the importance of giving the child a way to communicate. I can remember the frustration when I was 3 years old of not being able to communicate something that I wanted. And the one way you can have sign language or you can have a picture board, but they've got to have a way to communicate. And you start off just teaching the names of toys, names of foods. And it's very important to speak slowly to the child. My speech teacher would hold up a cup she'd hold up a cup, a coffee cup, and she'd say, now you say cup, and she'd say cuppa really, really slow. She'd say cuppa very, very slow, and then she'd alternate and say it regular. And then I was praised, for saying it. There's kind of three ways that you can have a problem with speech. Even though the child is not deaf, can pass a hearing test, when the adults talk really, really fast, it just sounds like blah, 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 blah. It just went into gibberish. That's why it's so important to slow down. Or you can have, I also had problems with getting my speech out. It's like having a big stutter. So it's really important when you're working with these little kids to work in a quiet environment. And when you ask the kid to say a word, give them time to respond. Their brain works at a slower speed. You've got to give the child time to respond. Another issue that you can have with a lot of these kids is sound sensitivity. They might start screaming at the train station or some other place where there's a lot of loud noise. They might not like something that makes a lot of loud noise. Now, sometimes a child can tolerate a loud noise if they make the noise. Let's say it's just hammering nails into a board somewhere. So you let them do it where they control the noise. Or it might be a bell that hurts their ears. You let the child control the noise. Now, obviously, they can't control the noise in a train station, but you give the child control. He might want to put on headphones to block out the noise. Well, you want to try to encourage them to not wear the headphones, but they're there if you really need them. Really need them, then you can put on the headphones. But there's been some children that could not tolerate a very, very noisy thing. And when they were given control of it, or then they learned to tolerate it better. But sensory problems are real. There's also some other kids that will have visual sensitivity. They get confused if there's a lot of just visual stimuli. So oftentimes things will work better if you get them in a quiet place to work with them. And so I want to work on speech. Also want to work on basic skills, eating, dressing, using the toilet, basic skills. Kids that will have often parents and teachers help the kid too much. He's trying to put on his coat. Some of these children have motor coordination problems. There's a tendency to help too much. You've got to just kind of stretch them to do new things. Now, somebody else had something to say. Talk about turn taking. I need to let people do that. I wasn't sure if someone wanted to take a turn. Now, the thing about autism is Einstein, the famous scientist, the theory of relativity. He had no speech until age 3. When he was a young child, he definitely did not have normal development. And look at what he accomplished. See, this is where you have a big range. And then there's some individuals that will never learn to speak. But some of these individuals who never learn to speak can learn to type on text messaging program, it's regular on a phone. It needs to be a tablet or a bigger phone. Learn to type. They can learn to communicate with a picture board. They can learn to do simple jobs. There's often a problem with underestimating, some of the things that they can do. On the individuals that become completely verbal, like me, you will tend to have uneven skills in school. Good at one subject, really bad at another subject. And this can be highly variable. When I was 8 years old, my ability in art became apparent. And my mother always encouraged my ability in art. You want to take the thing that the child is good at and build on it. Build on the thing they're good at. Now, I would just draw the same horse's head over and over and over again. Some other suggested drawing the entire horse. Maybe draw where the horse lives. Where do I ride the horse to? I broaden it out. And you may have some other children that are, autistic and socially awkward that might be really good at mathematics or maybe computer programming. And if they're good at these things, then give them more advanced math. Some of these kids are musically gifted, but in order to determine if a child's musically got musical skills, he has to be exposed to musical instruments. Children get interested in stuff they get exposed to. Now, when I was very young, there was a little flute that children played where it had little holes you had to finger. I could never learn how to play it, but at least I was given a chance to try this flute. And another kid is going to love this flute and become really good at playing it. I used to like to make things as a child. I spent hours making kites and parachutes and experimenting with them. These are things to encourage. And when I got older, I was kind of the odd kid. And where I had friends was through the shared interest. Maybe it could be flying kites together. I know, and thinking, in some countries, kites are really, really popular hobby. And that would be an interest that the child with autism could, do with another person. We've got to start looking at what they can do. The famous physicist, Stephen Hawking. Okay, Stephen Hawking, famous physicist. He studied black holes in outer space. He became completely crippled in an electric wheelchair. He had to use a thing that where he used his eyes to control a computer cursor to write. So he wrote very slowly. But the thing that he was really good at was doing mathematics in his head. And Stephen Hawking had a really good thing to say about disability. He said, concentrate on the things. Your disability does not prevent you from doing well. So let's say if a person got their legs injured and they were in a wheelchair and the top half is good, they can work in an office. They can do a job on a computer. We've got to start looking at what the person can do. There are some individuals that remain completely nonverbal. Now, I'm not that interested in the labels, whether you label them intellectual disability or autism. You have an individual that's nonverbal. Now, if he's been taught to dress himself, some of them can do a job. And they like doing a job where they feel that they are contributing. I heard about an adult that was that one teacher started working with. He was running off all kinds of problems. They were making him do stupid, busy work that he knew was fake work. So they put him to work doing some real work, stacking wood. It was a job that needed to be done. And he knew the difference between real work and fake work. We got to get more of the attitude of what the person can do. And you take somebody like Stephen Hawking, and you can look up his videos online, and you can see he's an electric wheelchair, very, very big disability. But he did mathematics. He could think mathematics in his head. It's the one thing that all his disability, where he could barely move, had no effect on mathematics, that he could do in his head. And now when individuals get older, I've seen people with a label of autism not learn how to work. Academic skills are different than work skills. And you need to start teaching work skills young, like chores around the house, just cleaning the house, just helping with the food preparation, learning to do a job. It's also very good for them to learn how to do a task where somebody outside the family is in charge of that task, like maybe helping out in the marketplace. You've got a vendor there that's selling vegetables. So each afternoon he works on setting up the stand and helping them sell the vegetables, where somebody else is the boss. When I was a teenager, I basically ran a horse barn. I cleaned stalls. I put the horses in and out of the barn, but that taught me working skills. I'm seeing some situations where a child may do very well academically, but hasn't learned work skills. Now, I've worked in heavy construction for 25 years, working on big food processing plants. And it was interesting to see who designs different parts of this gigantic factory. And there's two kinds of thinkers. There's visual thinkers like me. And if you watch the HBO movie, it shows how I think in pictures. Everything I think about is a picture. There's another kind of mind that does more mathematical types of engineering. And when you look at factories, they very clever equipment, like maybe a machine that packages food. That's usually made by the visual thinkers, like me, not by the mathematicians. And then things like electric power systems, refrigeration systems, the structure of the building so the roof doesn't fall down, that is made by the more mathematical engineers. And I was out on these very large projects, supervising construction of some equipment I designed. And there were many very talented workers there that today would be on the milder end of the autism spectrum. They were maybe dyslexic with a reading problem, or maybe kind of hyperactive, attention deficit. About 20% of these really smart people. And we wouldn't have gotten the plant built without them. And when they were kids, they were the kid that didn't talk. They were the kid who couldn't read. They were the kid that's just piles of trouble. And another thing that really helped me was my good teachers, starting with my mother. She made sure I learned how to eat correctly, got my skills. I had a wonderful teacher in primary school. Then when I was older and I was not interested in studying, I got a great science teacher. And what the science teacher did is he showed me that the reason why I should study is education's a pathway to a goal. It's not just something you do to make the family happy. You do education so I can become a scientist, or maybe somebody can become a doctor. I read a wonderful story in Science magazine just last week about a lady from India in poverty, no shoes. Her dad got sick with tuberculosis when she was 5, but he believed in education, and he told her, grow up, become a doctor, and find cures. And the next door neighbor gave her bus fare and gave her newspapers to read, which opened up a big window of the world. She is now a top vaccine scientist for COVID right now, a top vaccine scientist. And she never took her eyes off the goal. This is the kind of stuff, that I really like this, these kind of stories. I mean, this is a real person, Neeta Patel, vaccine scientist. I was reading the science behind her vaccine. It really, really looked good. But it's a big problem you have with a lot of disabilities and handicaps is the perception. There gets to be too much of a handicapped mentality. Oh, well, he's too fragile. He can't do this. But I want to emphasize, concentrate on the thing the kid can do. If he's good at mathematics, give him more math. Also introduce computer programming. And you can find free stuff online for teaching JavaScript, for teaching Python. Those are 2 of the main programs. Recently, the Dragon spacecraft just went to the International Space Station. And if you can look those videos up online, they're very fun videos from NASA to show students. And the display screens in the space capsule run on JavaScript. That's the same thing that runs video games. And you can find lessons online on that are free. And there are some kids on the autism spectrum, maybe some dyslexic kids, where they may just really be good at programming. I tried programming years ago when it was Fortran. I couldn't do it. But this is where work on the things that the individual can do. Well, I hope we're going to be getting some questions. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Usually when I've done these talks, there's lots of things in the chat, I'd like to have somebody ask me some questions.
Sure, Temple. We do are receiving questions. I was hoping that you would complete your this thing and then I will start. But before I take up the question, Dr. Stephen Shore, if you would like to give some message, some opening note for parents in this region.
Yeah, I certainly will. Be glad to. So a lot of what Temple said, I've seen that play out over and over for autistic individuals. For myself, after 18 months of typical development, I was struck with what I call the regressive autism bomb. And that happens to about 30% of us on the autism spectrum. So at 18 months, I lost functional communication, I had meltdowns, I withdrew from the environment, and in brief, I became a very autistic little kid. There was so little known about autism that it took my parents a whole year to find a place for diagnosis. And when they did, the doctor said, this kid is too sick, send him to an institution, because that was the prognosis for an autism diagnosis in the early 60s. Send them to an institution. Maybe if things go very, very well, they could do some simple job like pushing a broom, cleaning the floor. However, my parents, fortunately for me, they advocated on my behalf. Just like we're seeing ever increasing numbers of parents do that in India, Nepal, and around the world, my parents recognized that I could do a lot more than just wait an institution, and they can the diagnosing professionals to accept me to their school a year later. So it was during that year that my parents implemented what we would today refer to as an intensive home-based early intervention program. And this was a program that emphasized movement, music, sensory integration, narration, and imitation. And that's just today's terminology. Back then, the concept of early intervention didn't even exist. So what did my parents do? A lot of autistic people have difficulty with body to environmental relations, as described by practitioners of the Miller method, and so often worked on by occupational therapists as well. And in extreme cases, this is the person, for example, who may not know where their body ends and where the chair begins. In more mild cases, this is the person who is a bull in a china shop, someone who's clumsy, knocks things over, doesn't recognize their own strength. And so movement is so important for people like us on the autism spectrum. Communication, getting into my world. So my parents desperately tried to get me to imitate them, and that didn't work. Possibly due to a difference in mirror neurons, it may be difficult for autistic people to imitate, especially when young. Mm-hmm. So my parents flipped it around and they imitated me. And similarly to what Temple Grandin was talking about, you have a kid that's spinning a quarter, spinning a coin round and round. You don't just take it away, but you use it as an entryway or a lever in which to develop interaction. I wasn't spinning coins at that time, but I was making sounds that I heard from in the environment. And I was doing repetitive things, flapping my hands and so on. And that's what my parents did. And once they did that, I became aware of them in my environment. And I believe the key is that you have to meet the autistic child where they are and develop a trusting relationship. Then you can move on. And the music that my parents did, we had music on in the house all day, all night. We moved to music, we danced to music, we did things to music. And there's something about music that speaks to autistic people and to everybody, I believe, in general. Whatever seems to scramble the speech centers of the brain in autism tends to leave the musical ones intact. And I often find that when I teach autistic individuals music, they may not be able to speak. They may not have much expressive communication, but through careful teaching, these individuals too can learn how to play the piano and learn how to play other instruments just like anybody else. And what I find really interesting are those students who are functionally non-speaking, so they don't use words to communicate, but they can sing. When you play a piece that they know, sometimes they'll even play the piece and they'll sing it and they'll sound like anybody else. And I believe there's an important connection there between music and speech that can be used to help students acquire verbal interaction. I have some students that I would communicate with using a sing-song voice. So we'd sing back and forth to each other. If we spoke, then not much interaction would happen at all. So with the work that my parents did, speech began to return at age 4. And just like with Temple, there was the emphasis on communication. Fortunately for both Temple and I, we did learn how to speak, and we can use spoken word as our primary means of communication. However, we need to make sure that that autistic person has a reliable means of communication. It might be through pictures, picture exchange communication systems. It also might be through sign language, whatever it is. And even if that person requires you to speak, they will still have a reliable means of communication. And as Temple mentioned, it is so frustrating and anxiety producing when you are unable to communicate your needs or your wants. So at age 4, I entered the school that initially rejected me. I got reevaluated. Instead of being considered as psychotic and ready for an institution, I got upgraded to neurotic. So things were looking better in the world. Also at age 4 was my first highly focused interest. My parents found me at age 4 taking apart a watch with a sharp knife. I would pop open the back. I would extract the motor. I'd remove some of the gears. I'd spin them around and then put it all back together again, and the watch still worked. And there weren't any pieces left over. So a couple of important points from that. Number one, my parents recognized this as an ability, and they worked with that ability. Instead of looking at the closed door of disability, disorder, and deficit, my parents soon provided me with all kinds of other devices to take apart, and they'd also make sure I got them back together again. And I bring this up because it's important to recognize what are the strengths, what are the abilities of autistic individuals. We need to be asking, what can the autistic person do? And keeping this in mind, maybe watch repair could be a future area of study or possibly employment. And as Temple said, we don't know how far an autistic person is going to go. So at age 4, it looked like maybe I'd be a watchmaker or a watch repairman. I'd need a lot of support and communication and a lot of support living as an adult, but at least it was something I could do. And if it wasn't directly fixing watches, maybe that interest could be redirected to some sort of other repair, probably of small devices. Now, another thing that this brings out is, how could I have the fine motor control to take apart a watch with a sharp knife? However, when it came to penmanship, I was a total disaster area. And something that occupational therapists work with a lot, improving penmanship. So how could I have the fine motor control to do one thing and not another? And there are some neurological reasons for that. Additionally, what this also tells us is that there is a sharp line of demarcation between ability and disability that autism brings us. Both Temple and I talk about strengths, using strengths for promoting fulfilling and productive lives. But at the same time, we still have to recognize the real challenges and real disabilities that can come with being autistic. Well, then onwards to age 6, I entered regular school kindergarten. That was a social and academic catastrophe. You know what happens to children who are different in grade school? Both Temple and I have talked about being bullied. Almost everybody I know on the autism spectrum has been bullied in school. Fortunately, school systems have now begun to realize that bullying is not a developmental phase that children need to go through, and things are being done about it. Academically, I was about a grade behind in most of my subjects. But I still liked going to school because school had a regular schedule. School is where I could learn things. I was fascinated by all kinds of things. And my favorite activity all through grade school would be to go to the library and get all the books on whatever I was interested in. A stack of books on astronomy, then later on weather, maybe earthquakes, volcanoes, dinosaurs, whatever it was. And I'd put them all on my desk. I'd read them. I'd take notes. I'd copy diagrams. Sometimes even wonder if there was more to school, such as reading in groups or doing math with other people, but I just kind of did my own thing. And I think what that translated to is the teachers didn't quite know how to reach me. But at the same time, since I wasn't a behavior problem, they just left me to my own devices. And I think in this situation, it was probably for better rather than for worse, because there was so little known about autism in those days. I remember in third grade, a stack of astronomy books on my desk, and a teacher told me that I'd never learn how to do math. But somehow I've learned just enough math to teach statistics at the university level. Now these days, I'm seeing increasing numbers of educators who would notice this type of special interest and then work with that interest, in this case, to teach mathematics. And so I'm seeing more using interests to develop as intrinsic reinforcers. So what I mean by that is, let us suppose we have a grade school child who's not interested in doing math. Maybe they're not good at math. But we also find that they love to use a flight simulator on a computer. Now, commonly a system would be set up where we get the child to do math for 20 minutes. And if they do what they need to do for 20 minutes, then they can use the flight simulator as a reinforcer for the remaining 10 minutes of class. However, in a way, that's working against the characteristics of autism as opposed to with the characteristics. Now, what I would do is I'd find a way to use that flight simulator to teach mathematics, to give the reason why. Why are we bothering to learn something that's kind of difficult? And in that way, mathematics now becomes intrinsically reinforcing.
Yeah.
And we don't have to fade away an extrinsic reinforcer. In middle and high school, you don't need to be autistic to have difficulty in middle and high school. But for me, it was actually easier because I was able to engage in my highly focused interest of music. I joined the band. Now I had a structured activity in which to mediate my interactions with others. And so often we find that when autistic individuals or students who aren't autistic or don't have any documented disability, they may often fall flat when it comes to academics, but you put them in a wood shop, mechanic shop, electrical, classes on electricity, or any one of these specials types of courses, and these students really shine in these areas, which is why it's important to expose students to working with their hands and to being able to make things. And that gets on to employment that Temple talked about earlier. Employment, preparation for employment begins with chores around the house. Because chores around the house, whether it's making the bed, feeding the cat, taking out the trash, they tend to be cyclical in nature. You have to do them over and over. You have to achieve a certain proficiency at them. And you have to do them whether you like it or not. everybody has to go to work, even on days that they don't want to go to work. And it's this regular exposure to these chores that go far in developing a good work ethic. Then, as Temple mentioned, by middle and high school, the autistic person should have a job outside the house. And I remember at that time I got a paper route. Paper route was a great business in miniature form that could be handled by a child. And in addition to the regularity of having to do it, whether I wanted to or not, in addition to having to gain proficiency and becoming good at it, I also had to be good enough so that my customers would keep me and I wouldn't drop customers. I had to deliver the papers correctly, put them between the doors so that they wouldn't get wet whenever it rained. And in that way, that was good training for employment. Later on, I got fascinated with bicycles, and I did with bicycles what I did with watches. I could take a bicycle apart down to the ball bearings and put that back together again, which eventually led to employment as a bicycle mechanic in high school, and then later on in college. And fixing bicycles was a great way to pay for college. And I remember plastering my college campus with thousands of signs advertising that I could fix your bicycle too. And I'd get all these phone calls, and I'd have up to a dozen bicycles in various stages of repair in my room. And it was great. I could spend all day on Saturday, fix bicycles, and come out with maybe $200 at the end of the day, which was much better, much more interesting to me than doing a boring work study job as a security guard. Now, another thing that needs to be addressed is living with other people. I wonder how my roommate felt about having all these bicycles on my side of the dorm room. It wasn't on his side of the dorm room, it was my side of the dorm room. But still, it was probably something that I shouldn't have done. And my older sister, upon finding out about it, made sure that I just got those bicycles out of the room, except when I was fixing a particular bicycle. But otherwise, they had to be stored somewhere else. So after college, during college, my bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degree, I'd written 3 books, including an autobiography, Beyond the Wall, another book on self-advocacy for people on the spectrum, and also Understanding Autism for Dummies. I'd also begun presenting around the world, talking about autism, and then got a job as a professor of special education, focusing mostly on issues related to autism, whether it's teaching educators and other people in related fields to support autistic individuals, and also researching on autism, writing books on autism. And here I am giving workshops and webinars, just like I'm doing right now, talking to you.
That's great to hear, sir.
Thank you, Stephen. And I have some questions coming in. Uh, uh, Dr. Grandin, we have a question more to do with the inappropriate touching. I understand it's about inappropriate touching of private parts. This is a question by Sazmun Nahar, and her daughter is 9.5. She is nonverbal. She has strong sensory needs. She may not understand social stories, and she does not have understanding of private parts